So, Maria Repnikova, thank you very much for joining me for Friday Q&A. You're the author of many things, most recently a book about soft power and Chinese soft power. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, what do you make of the goings-on in Ukraine? We're talking on Wednesday, February 23rd. And yesterday, Putin made a speech in which he proclaimed support for the independence of the two breakaway people's republics.
Yeah, the Ukraine crisis has been very much on my mind also. Just, I have close Ukrainian friends and I've been observing this crisis for years as it's been unfolding since 2014, if not before. So it's been feeling quite personal because I myself am from Latvia, so I had the background and, being from that region and Russia's relations with the region are very complex and tense, to say the least. So that's something that is just, just from a personal perspective, it's been very nerve-wracking. But in terms of China's view or how China has been engaging, reacting, I've been going through various statements by Chinese officials, from foreign ministry to Chinese ambassadors, including Chinese ambassadors to the UN, to social media statements and Chinese press. And I'm finding some continuities and some differences from the 2014 statements that China has made on the Crimea annexation. So some similarities are basically that China still takes a fairly neutral, kind of vague approach to this crisis in comparison to many other, especially major powers. Not so much direct critique of Russia, but overarching statement is basically that, we should resolve this crisis peacefully. And both parties, meaning Ukrainians and Russians, should come together and engage in dialogue and just attempt to resolve this through diplomacy. So basically, there's no explicit blame of Russia. It's very much kind of a vague statement that the responsibility is shared across both parties and they should decide this amongst themselves. So that's the overarching, I think, kind of statement that's coming out. At the same time, there is some differences between now and 2014. In particular, I think there's a stronger emphasis on U.S. as kind of the faulty actor, the provocateur in this crisis. So today's, press testimony by Hua Chunying, when she was making those remarks with journalists, she was basically stating that the U.S. is behind, this crisis escalating and that sanctions don't work. So direct critique of sanctions as a form of disciplining and resolving this crisis, and China making a very clear statement that they're against the sanctions. And the other thing I noticed is that overall this crisis has been kind of underreported and sort of hidden in some Chinese media coverage. If you look at major newspapers, major media, including CGTN or Remin and many others, you don't really see Ukraine at the heart of the coverage the way you see it in Western media or Russian media or Ukrainian media. It's just not at the top of the page. And in fact, many other less important stories are occupying the center of coverage. So to me, that also signals that they don't want to overblow the crisis. They're afraid of domestic reactions, and they're still figuring out how to really respond as it unfolds. So that's my brief kind of summary of that.
Right. But there does seem to be a sort of base level of like rock solid support for Russia. Even just based on the timing of Putin being in Beijing for the Olympic opening ceremony and the statement that was made at that time of closer comradeship than has been expressed since Stalin's day, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, but at the same time, when it comes to supporting them militarily or supporting their Putin's recent claim or proclamation of these so-called independent regions of Ukraine and threatening to use force, and I think his 1-hour speech was really a lot more, a lot more threatening, beyond those independent regions. It was really about independence of Ukraine as a whole, and he was claiming Ukraine was never its own independent country. It was always part of Russia, before the Soviet regime, during the Soviet regime, and even after. It was always depending on Russia, and it should be grateful to Russia. That was one of his key, I think, themes coming out of this very, very long speech, very wordy speech. But President Xi and Chinese officials haven't really stood by this type of argument, and they haven't stood by the annexation of potential annexation of those regions. They haven't stood by the proclamations of independence. So I think there is definitely support in terms of standing by Russia kind of symbolically, rhetorically, in terms of, not blaming Russia directly. So both parties are guilty. And in fact, U.S. is actually equally guilty here or responsible for this crisis. But at the same time, not saying, we 100% support what Russia is proclaiming and we're standing by Russia militarily. So I think there's kind of definitely some degree of closeness and support, but not fully on board with what Russia is doing.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So the second question then for today is a little bit on themes from your book, Chinese Soft Power. Can you talk a little bit about the main thesis of your book? And I'm particularly interested in the ways in which you've studied the Chinese conception of soft power and how it differs from the original concept, at least as it was articulated by Joseph Nye.
Yeah, thank you for asking. The key theme of the book, and something that I try to unpack throughout the chapters, is the distinct conceptualization and practice of soft power by Chinese thinkers, scholars, and also policymakers, again, in contrast to Nye's original concept. So what is the key distinction? I think there are twofold. One is that Chinese conceptualization of soft power and its actual practice very much fuses together material power and cultural power. So there's not really a clear separation between cultural and material, especially economic power. I think it's very much seen as part of China's overall branding, image making, persuasive efforts. So they don't really see soft power in, I guess, as strict of a sense as Nye has originally proposed it, as culture, values, and foreign policy, but it includes almost anything that is advantageous for China to advertise. If it's technology, it's technology. If it's education, it's education. If it's scholarship, it's scholarship. It's building roads, that's also soft power. So basically anything that helps promote its image counts as soft power. So it's very fluid. So that's the first key distinction. The second one is that the orientation of soft power.
Any kind of power that doesn't actually involve military force, like if you're not dropping a bomb, but you're exercising power, that sort of counts. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think they're not including security or military force in their discussions of soft power, but they do include any form of economic power can be counting as soft power. So I think it's much more open-ended and flexible idea. So, one could argue from Nye's perspective, and from perspective of, I guess, Western policymakers, is that that's not soft power. They often critique it as co-optation. Parts of it or some of its implementation could be counted as sharp power. But from Chinese perspective, it's just a much more open-ended version of what soft power means. They directly critique Nye's original concept.
Or realistic, maybe, a cynic might say.
More realistic, more pragmatic approach to soft power.
Pragmatic, right. I interrupted
and then there's
you.
the other dimension. The other side of it that I explore a lot as well is the motivations behind soft power. So in Nye's original concept, the motivation is primarily externally oriented. So it's all about, changing hearts and minds of, global publics or whichever target audience the U.S. government is hoping to convince or align with. But in Chinese conceptualization, the motivation is very much also domestic. So I was struck by just how much of this rhetoric about soft power was about domestic cultural cohesion, patriotism, allegiance, and to the party, as well as the idea of cultural security, and security meaning also protection from Western cultural infiltration. So they're using military jargon and some quite strong words there, strong terms to think about how to conserve China from Western influence. So by making it more confident, by making Chinese public more confident in China's image externally, they're hoping to also kind of create more cohesion and allegiance, behind the status quo, basically. So the motivation, I think, is very much dual, and we see this a lot in how it's implemented. Sometimes it's seen as a failure externally, but actually it's very much appealing to domestic publics.
Yeah, that does actually make sense. I mean, I think as an immigrant to the United States, the only country I've ever known where people are so willing to wave flags and be sort of so openly nationalistic in a certain kind of way, China and America, and I think
very similar in that way.
American soft power definitely does include the power to make its own people, feel proud of it as a country. So that actually makes total sense. So how did the Winter Olympics make you think about your ideas on Chinese soft power? Did you change your mind about anything, or what did you think of China's sort of performance? Because, I mean, surely if there's one event that is all about soft power, it's the Olympics.
Yeah, in the book, I talk about the previous Olympics because when it was coming out, in press, this Olympics hasn't concluded yet. So I was making some potential kind of predictions how things might go, but I didn't yet observe it. But, there's some striking, I think, similarities also in contrast with previous Olympics and how it plays into soft power. I mean, first of all, Olympic Games, like you said, it's kind of like the key manifestation in some ways of soft power, but also they're very contentious events. They attract a lot of attention to China's domestic politics and human rights issues, but not just to China. I think any country that hosts Olympics, they get mixed coverage, both positive and, the excitement and congratulatory kind of remarks and in the press, but also some, investigations and critiques of how it affects domestic just society, often in adverse ways. And I think that's very much true for China. So I was expecting actually stronger reaction, I think, stronger negative reaction from international community and media. But I think in some ways this Olympics has been so subdued because it was such a bubble and the media wasn't even journalists weren't allowed to really go outside of the bubble to cover anything in Beijing or anywhere else in China. They were in this really restricted environment. I think that's one of the kind of factors that played into maybe more subdued coverage. And part of it is also there were some unexpected stories that emerged. For example, the dual Chinese-American athlete Erin Gao, right? And she became kind of the star of the show. So some of these kind of unexpected, unanticipated stories, I think, played into the power of Chinese, image and soft power, I guess. But overall, I guess Olympic Games last time around didn't really shift global perceptions about China in a positive way. If anything, the ratings kind of dropped in terms of public opinion polls. So I'm not expecting dramatic changes this time around either in terms of a more positive perception of China as a whole. But domestically, I think there has been so much propaganda and so many media stories about how well, China has done in terms of the medals, but also just being able to host the games without, major crisis. And I don't know if anybody got sick, but overall kind of containing the boundaries of this whole event during a pandemic. So I think domestically it has played into China's kind of Communist Party legitimacy. But internationally, I'm not expecting, huge gains or a huge shift in terms of how, international publics think about China.
Right. Can I ask, sort of on that theme, what's your sense of how big the gap is between Chinese self-perceptions and international perceptions of China? Because I sort of feel that, for about a decade or so, they were getting closer and closer. Maybe the height was around 2012 or so when, Weibo was very active and the Chinese internet was huge, a great deal of the population on it, and not quite the strict censorship of, the Xi Jinping era. It hadn't kicked in yet. And whereas now I feel as though China is as closed as it's ever been. And on the other hand, a lot of people outside of China are less and less inclined to give China any kind of mental space. Do you think the gap is big? Do you think
gap
it's
between
wide?
How Chinese government sees itself?
How Chinese
and how
people, actually, regular Chinese people,
see
including
themselves.
And how foreigners, people outside of China, see them.
Yeah, I think the gap has expanded. I think especially under Xi Jinping, like you said, the country is more closed than ever, in addition to the pandemic, but also so many sparks and spikes in nationalism over the past few years. I think from how China has handled the pandemic to all kinds of increasingly negative coverage of what's happening here in the US, like January 6th events and many other events just reported kind of blatantly in a very, I think, pessimistic, negative way. So China comes off as sort of the winner or as doing quite well domestically and globally in this coverage. And then also such limited travel, limited exposure constraints, I guess, one's perspective in terms of what else could be said or how else one could think about China. So I think there is kind of an increasing, maybe kind of skewed public opinion towards favorability or some kind of degree of confidence of how well China is doing. But then externally, like you said, there's very limited space for giving kind of the benefit of the doubt or saying, oh, maybe they had other reasons or maybe we should trust in their decision making or we should re-engage. I think there's still a lot of suspicion and just a very critical mindset vis-a-vis China. Of course, that depends on where. It really, I think, ranges, something I covered in the book as well. It ranges by regions. We see maybe a little bit more engagement in the global south, especially in Africa. We've been doing research in some countries. There's a bit more enthusiasm for engaging with China. So I think we have to be also cautious about kind of not claiming all public opinion, but maybe kind of dividing it more across different regions in terms of how China is, how it's favored, how it's seen.
Can you talk a little bit about the global south, well, Africa in particular? I know where you've done quite a lot of research, current perceptions of China. Because some of the most sort of vigorous defenses of China I've seen recently, on the internet and in the media have been from Africa.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to engage with this new project. Well, it's been a couple of years, but I did most of my fieldwork in Ethiopia pre-pandemic, so more limited in terms of the scope. But I've been observing, the public debates and public opinion polls, and interviewing a lot of African elites in Beijing as well, again with pre-pandemic time. So I guess, my impression is somewhat mixed. On the one hand, public opinion polls tell one story, which is very favorable. We see just much more favorable public opinion vis-a-vis China in Africa, for instance, versus almost anywhere else, including other parts of Global South. But when we look at kind of in-depth interviews or go a little bit under that public opinion kind of spectrum and just ask deeper questions and engage in various discussions, there's still a lot of suspicion, critique, and pushback and concern with China's influence. So I think it really depends on how one actually asks and talks about China. So even the same elites that might say, yeah, China is great, oftentimes, I call it performative legitimation. So they perform allegiance to China in part, because they have to publicly. They want to maintain the relationship. They want to get, new investments, free trips to China, free education. All of that is very beneficial. So it's very opportunistic. So if you ask them about that, of course they won't decline, because why not? That's the only source of, benefits in some ways. But at the same time, if you ask further questions about, are there concerns with China's presence, investments, environmental impact, labor practices, just overall influence of China in your country, there are still a lot of concerns, unresolved tensions, and very limited information and coverage of China beyond kind of official media, Confucius Institutes, very little training about China beyond very kind of specific channels. Some of them are state sponsored by, Chinese state. So I think the picture is maybe more complex than public opinion polls tell us, and Chinese scholars themselves, when they write about Africa and Chinese soft power in Africa, I was surprised by how, there's no overwhelming consensus that they're doing great. So they say that, overall, China sees Africa as very kind of exciting space to experiment with soft power and to create new allegiances and, legitimize itself globally. But at the same time, many scholars also argue that, they could do better, but they often blame the West for that. So they say, again, the West, US is curtailing China's discourse power. They're spreading stereotypes and misrepresent China's story. So the goal of China is to kind of correct Western stereotypes. So that's been something I've been reading about in Chinese. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So, but that's kind of the story of China's, that's what they're saying about everything now. So it's all about the West, right?
It's all America's fault at some point, yeah.
Yeah, at some point if only America wasn't there, everything would be
great.
Perfect. Yeah, but can't fix that, I guess.
Well, Maria, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for answering these questions, and
of course, thank you for having me.
Have a great week. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So,
okay.
Just